Hey guys, okay, today is What If Operation Unthinkable happened by Alternate History Hub. Now, this one is, for those that do not know, Operation Unthinkable was a plan that obviously did not happen. It was following the fall of the Reich, and it was a plan for the Allied forces to not stop the war and continue pushing on through the Soviet Union. How this could have would have gone, it's hard to say. It most likely would have resulted in a lot more death, um, for obvious reasons. However, I think by this point, I don't think the Soviets could have resisted. Um, Certainly they would have had early successes, but I do not think beyond the early parts of the war, I don't think they'd last long against the uh, might of both the British Empire and all of her dominions and colonies and the United States of America. That by this point, the United States economy was in full swing as well as the British economy. The Soviet economy would still be recovering, and much of their occupied land would be absolutely destroyed, while more land, I'd say, in the western side is more capable of quickly being built up and serving the war effort. So, yeah, I mean, there'd be lots of dead, millions upon millions more, but I think the odds are just too far stacked against the Soviets. They don't have the air superiority for it. They can't match the British and the United States in terms of air quality. They would not have been able to even match against one of those powers in terms of navy. The United States is servicing an armed force alone that is like roughly the same size as the Soviets because they have similar populations. So, yeah, well, at least at the start of the war, the United States and the Soviet Union had a similar total population, roughly around 130 million or something like that. But anyways, I'm going to stop rambling and going on tangents, and we're going to hear what Alternate History Hub has to say.
It's no surprise that the West and the USSR hated each other. It's no surprise that
Wow,
immediately
this is a
after
really old video from him.
Berlin fell, the Iron Curtain rose. Yet it is a surprise that there was a plan so ludicrous
God, he
and
was young.
dangerous, it not only would have caused World War III, but nuclear war. It came from none other than Winston Churchill. This plan was...
Well, hold up. Would it really have caused nuclear war, though? Because I don't think it was until 1948 at the earliest in which the Soviets tested a bomb, I think. And it might have been not until the 50s, really. And if that was the case, I don't think the Soviets started really having nukes into the double digits until the 50s. So, United States did have an upper hand and a monopoly on the nuclear weapons for a good few years, so.
It's called Operation Unthinkable. Churchill was angry at the amount of countries the Soviets claimed influence over after Nazi Germany fell.
Well, they did free pretty much all of these nations themselves, or well, free. I wouldn't call a one-party system really liberating.
He believed that when World War II was finished, that the USSR would have been on the brink of collapse. However, this was not the case, and Churchill did not like this.
Yeah, sorry to pause mid-sentence, but to go off of Churchill's thinking, he does have a point, though. For one, the Soviet economy is in complete shambles by this point, by the end of World War II. Two, their food supply is pretty much only being propped up by the Americans and the British food relief through Lend-Lease that occurred during the war. So, like, they're on some shaky ground.
This new world. The USSR had begun installing new communist
But they did
governments
have a
in
large
Eastern
army, so that
Europe,
helped.
and their armies were too far west in Churchill's eyes. Thus, he proposed a solution called Operation Unthinkable, and it was truly unthinkable. The plan was a full-scale Anglo-American conflict against the Russians. It was meant to drive out the Soviet forces from Germany, Poland, and Eastern Europe to counter Russia's ever-growing power. Since it was so
God, I
over
really
the
wonder
top,
what the
many
world would have
thought
looked like had
Operation
this happened.
Unthinkable was suicidal. Thus, the plan of total war was quickly ignored by reasonable leaders. Soon after, Churchill was voted out of office for unrelated reasons. Yet what if Operation Unthinkable was put into effect? What if it actually happened? What would be the outcome if such a strange plan was carried out? Well, here is one scenario. The first obstacle the Allied powers, allied as in British and Americans, would have had to overcome is the vast numbers difference between them and the Russians. The Russian force numbered in total of 11 million, 6.5 of which were on the German front. The Soviet army simply outnumbered the Anglo-American force 2-1. So how would the Allies counter?
I don't think it was. I'm going to Google American Armed Forces in 1945. Armed Forces. Supposedly, in 1945, it was 12 million. So, right? Is this accurate? But shortly following the end of the war, the U.S. would demobilize fairly fast down to back to under, like, I think a million or something, around 1 to 2 million. But I think by now, when we say armed forces numbers, that obviously does not mean just infantry. That is including every branch, right? So they could be outnumbered, but I think the United States could reasonably mobilize an army, even if it's conscripted. A conscripted army of 12 million or 8 to 10 million really fast.
Counter this? Well, the plan was to rearm 100,000 captured German soldiers and revive the destroyed German war machine. This time, however, under Allied control against the Russians. Yet even bringing back the Germans would not be enough to equal the Soviets, so there was another option: nuclear war. Churchill knew about Project Manhattan and how the Americans had the potential to create a nuclear bomb. Keep in mind, this was before the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the plan was to harness American nukes to bomb USSR cities, most importantly Moscow, Kiev, and such. In his mind, this would be enough to crush the Soviets into submission and force their retreat.
I'm fairly certain at least Kiev, that city was probably in ruins from the fighting, from the German invasion. Moscow wasn't really reached or touched by the Germans, so, yeah, that target kind of makes sense. But, like, much of Russia's, like, western cities are not in good condition, so I don't think bombing them with a nuke is going to change much.
Retreat, or at least disorient them while the Allied forces swept over Europe. Operation Unthinkable goes into effect. On July 1st, 1945, the Allied powers launch a full-scale military assault against Russian positions. This coalition of British, American, and German forces, 47 divisions in total, cross into communist territory. The fighting is brutal, drawn out, in an upward fight for the Allies. Not only would they need to push past Germany, but into Poland, East Russia, Moscow, or even farther to stop any USSR resistance. The Soviets begin to overtake the Allies, and the Americans decide to bring in the big guns. Diverting nukes that were meant for Japan, the US drops Little Boy on Moscow. The Kremlin and a large portion
So we were okay. I was thinking this was taking place like right after Japan had surrendered as well. Like all threats were eliminated, and now the first two threats were eliminated, the Germans and the Japanese, and now the only threat that remains is the communists. In 1940s thinking. And so, now you go to war with them, now that you're freed up on the Pacific theater. But no, Going to war with them while still fighting the Japanese. Okay.
Destroyed. This catches the Russian forces off guard, and the Allies are...
So then, definitely by this point, at this time period, the United States is most certainly the only nation in the world with nuclear power. Soviets would not have it still for a few more years, so yeah.
Push closer to Berlin. However, after the shock goes away, the Russians slowly fight back the Americans and British. This goes in part with the fact that the Russians simply outnumbered the Allies and eventually would be able to beat them back. Perhaps a few more nuclear bombs would be dropped on Russia over the next few months, but this would not deter the Soviets. Soon the Russians would invade France and the Allies would retreat to Britain. Soviet V-2 rockets could then strike London. This scenario isn't an 100% prediction, but just judging by the balance of power, armies, and conditions of the time, it's a fair representation of what probably would have occurred.
I'm actually disagreeing with Alternate History Hub for once.
Position to battle the Soviets right after a world war. The Russians had taken half of Europe and installed their own allied governments. That's the reason why Operation Unthinkable was never put into effect, or even considered as an immediate offensive measure. How do you think the world would be if...
I think he's revisited this. I feel like he has to have revisited this, because this sounds like a familiar prospect that he's done recently. I feel like I've heard him with a different opinion on this before. Because this is certainly only 5 minutes. I feel like he's done this. I feel like he's revisited this question and gone into greater detail. Huh. I do disagree. I think, yes, the Soviets would see early successes, but I don't think they could keep up with the sheer amount of resources that the United States alone can throw at a war. The sheer amount of production that the United States is capable of. Yes, towards the end of the war, the Soviets were, in terms of, I believe, sheer numbers, were definitely, I think, in most cases, making more equipment in certain fields than the Americans were. Like, I think the Soviets ended up eventually making more tanks than the United States over the course of the war in total. However, the Soviets would be on the defensive, and they definitely do not have the air force capable of resisting both the British and the Americans. So their factories would just get bombed, and they would lose that production lead that they have eventually, right? Kind of like what happened with the Germans at the beginning of the war. The Germans most certainly had a production lead on the other nations it was at war with, but it eventually lost its air. Once it lost its air superiority and started getting bombed by the British, and then eventually, following war declaration on the United States, the United States bombers and planes were starting to fly over Germany as well. And they started losing their factories, and they really started losing their productivity means of production. So yeah, that's my thought at least. What do you guys think would have happened? Let me know down in the comments below, as well as any suggestions for another video you'd like to see me react to next. As always, thank you for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.